I wonder if people are just watching us in the green room.
I think we can probably get started if you're all ready.
Yes.
I wonder if people are just watching us in the green room.
Sorry about that. I always have to forget I have to mute YouTube that's broadcasting on the other side. We create an echo chamber. So thank you all for tuning in. I'm Dina Beard. I'm the director of the lab. And I'd like to say that the lab sits on Ramaytush Ohlone land, now known as San Francisco. We extend our gratitude and respect to the many indigenous people who have stewarded this land for generations. Of course, we cannot reconcile a democracy based on genocide and slavery, and so extend our resources to those who can demonstrate what the world might look like outside of that fundamental contradiction. So with that in mind, the lab provides significant funding to artists alongside the keys to our space and the option to revise any and all aspects of our operating model. So our current commissioned artists are playwright Asher Hartman, dancers Jose Abad and Keith Hennessy, and Tongo Eisen-Martin, who we will hear from tonight. So this work is entirely supported by our community. Please consider signing up for a membership or making a donation on our website. 100% of the money that you give goes directly to artists. So we invite our activists and artists to these forums to offer their proposals across many different contexts, but we really need you, the audience, to help us make sense of the ideas they put forward. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask questions, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can ask questions in the comments section. And as a reminder, the lab can offer real-time translation and live closed captioning when requested in advance. So please reach out to us at the labsf@thelab.org so that we can make arrangements. But for now, I'll put a link in the chat to a transcription service available online. But today I'm so glad to have Gerald Horne and Tongo Eisen-Martin joining us tonight from Houston and San Francisco, respectively. I'm continually inspired by their work. Gerald Horne is an American historian who holds the John J. and Rebecca Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He writes about topics he perceives as misrepresented struggles for justice, in particular communist struggles and struggles against imperialism, colonialism, fascism, racism, and white supremacy. Tongo Eisen-Martin is a poet, movement worker, and educator. His curriculum on the extrajudicial killing of Black people, We Charge Genocide Again, has been used as an educational and organizing tool throughout the country. His latest book, Heaven is All Goodbyes, won a California and American Book Award and was shortlisted for the Griffin Poetry Prize. So with that, thank you, Gerald and Tongo, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Much appreciation. Thank you to the lab, and much appreciation to Dr. Horne for giving us the honor of this conversation. I think I mean there are a million there are a million elephants in the world right now, but I was wondering what your thoughts on January 6th. And, this kind of neo-Confederate tendency that seems to be getting better and better organized, or publicly better organized.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, thank you for asking that question, because January 6th has been occupying a lot of my mental space for the last days or so. I think that to try to link it with our ostensible topic today, in many ways, when I saw the storming of the Capitol, I began to think of the storming of Native American villages, which helped to create this phenomenon known as settler colonialism. I began to think of the storming of villages in Africa, leading to the enslavement of our ancestors and their free labor for centuries. And I found it striking that Congressman Jody Hice of Georgia was amongst the number of conservatives who suggested that this was, quote, their 1776 moment, unquote. Now, I think that those words not only expose the reality of what happened in 1776. That is to say, as I said in my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, it was a far cry from establishing any sort of liberty, equality, etc. It was even a far cry from establishing equality amongst those of European descent. But certainly, I thought that what was at stake was an attempt to turn the clock back to the past. The only question is, how far back in the past would they like to turn back the clock? What I mean is that if you look at that term that's curiously absent from the vocabulary, even of those who consider themselves to be radical, I'm speaking of the term settler colonialism, which is this system that has been constructed in North America on unceded land. It involved a class collaboration between and amongst those of European descent, initially those of English, Irish, Welsh, Scotch, and Irish descent, for their mutual advantage and for the aim of pillaging and plundering the indigenous and ultimately enslaving the Africans. Now, what happened since that period began in the post-1492 period is that we, that is to say the Africans and the indigenous and our allies, were able to push back successfully to a degree and push for the abolition of slavery per 1865 and the retreat of Jim Crow or US apartheid in the 1950s. But simultaneously, even though some of the propagandists and their naive followers take the point of view that this process was embraced universally throughout North America, the fact of the matter is that there were revolts against this process. After all, there was a civil war that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands in order to retain slavery. After Jim Crow began to erode, you had riots in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, where President Eisenhower had to send in federal troops. You had riots in Oxford, Mississippi, when the University of Mississippi was about to be desegregated, leading to deaths, to show you that it was not sectional or geographic. There were riots in Boston in the 1970s when there was an attempt to desegregate the schools. And so I think that what we saw on January 6th was just another revolt, another counter-revolutionary revolt, not unlike the mob action that overthrew Black-influenced governments in the South post-1865, not unlike mob action that overthrew a Black-influenced government in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, which, by the way, was on the front page of the Raleigh News and Observer, North Carolina's leading newspaper, this past Sunday, comparing 1898 with 2021. And I think that in many ways, it creates a crossroads. What I mean is that for the 1%, for the economic royalists, as they say, they had a nice hustle going. Basically, what happened is that they enlisted as foot soldiers the non-elite Euro-American working class and middle class to vote for the GOP, vote for the Republican Party, which in turn provided tax cuts and other giveaways to the 1%. But of course, the foot soldiers were not doing as well, and they revolted. Now, that leaves the 1% with the real jam, because they obviously have been relying upon a base that is stable as nitroglycerin, which is one of the reasons why belatedly you've seen many in the corporate sector, at least they say they're pulling the plug on giving further donations to certain Republican Party politicians. We shall see if they follow through on that. But I think it's clearly a response to the tumult, the sedition, the insurrection, the failed coup of January 6th. Also, January 6th will have enormous impact on the global standing of the United States. Keep in mind that we, the oppressed, always have to pay attention to what's going on globally, because we have been able to rely upon global allies to push on our behalf. And indeed, that's one of the weaknesses of our movement today, is that we don't rely upon global allies as much as we did, for example, in the period of slavery, as much as we did, for example, during the period of Jim Crow. Now, it's interesting that as historians of the future will no doubt note that as January 6th was unfolding, this attempt to prevent the transfer of power from one administration, Trump, to another administration, Biden, there was a certain unanimity of opinion between the two, setting aside their differences. That unanimity of opinion was regards to launching a new Cold War against China. Now, if you want, I can talk about how that evolved over the decades, but suffice it for now to say that that project now is in jeopardy. It's in jeopardy because A, on December 31st, 2020, Britain withdrew formally from the European Union, which removed Washington's main agent in the higher councils of the European Union from that body, thereby strengthening the role of the political force in the European Union, that is France, which more than most imperialist powers have been willing to buck US imperialism. And President Macron of France has been talking about strategic autonomy, which is one of the reasons why the European Union inked an investment deal with China just before January 6th over the objections of both Trump and Biden. which suggests that the European Union will be unwilling to enter this new Cold War against China. If the European Union does not enter this new Cold War against China, I don't see why Japan and India will, or any other major power, which thereby jeopardizes that project and accentuates the point that as a result of the pandemic, which hampers our ability to talk face to face, there have been approximately 4,000 to 5,000 deaths in the 1.5 billion strong Chinese population. You have that 4,000 to 5,000 figure as one day in the United States of America, or correspondingly, the total of the Bronx, New York, since January 2020. At the same time, the Chinese economy is slated to grow by 8% in 2021 as it recovers. We can only hope the United States will recover by the summer. So I say all this to say, to answer your question, that I dare say that historians of the future will no doubt see January 6th as a hinge moment in not only US history, but global history. And the only question is, will our movement be able to adapt to this fast moving, fast changing situation, or will we be stuck fighting previous wars and with previous mindsets? Now, I could probably talk for the rest of our session on this topic, but I'll stop there because I know you have other things in mind.
Well, just a quick follow up. So this neo Confederate tendency, definitely more organized than than they would have you believe. Definitely more, seriously collaborated with. But as far as the ruling class goes, how deep is that tendency? Do you have, like, is the ruling class split? And also how long, because we also see how I don't want to call it goofy, but we see how that move it didn't have the sharp teeth. It didn't have the teeth to get them to the finish line. But now, how long will it take, do you think, for this neo-Confederate side? How long do you think for them to consolidate power so they can start making stronger moves?
Well, point number one, stay tuned. The next few days are going to be quite rocky. I'm sure you know about the planned manifestations on January 17th, and of course for Inauguration Day. According to Congressman Andy Kim of New Jersey, there are more US troops in Washington, D.C. now than in Afghanistan and Iraq combined. And of course, you may want to examine that comparison further, because one of the imponderables in terms of our discussion is that the vanguard, if you like, of January 6th, the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, the neo-Nazis, many of their leaders were trained militarily to fight in Afghanistan and Iraq. They were trained to resolve political disputes through the barrel of a gun. And inevitably, there has been blowback. That is to say, they brought those skills back to their homeland, chickens coming home to roost, to coin a phrase. And it's unclear, number one, what their ties are to the political leadership in Washington. Now, there's interesting anecdotal evidence. I take it, first of all, there are revelations emerging every day. Probably as I'm speaking, there are more revelations. One of the latest revelations is that Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill of New Jersey said that on January 5th, she detected, and has a military background, she detected reconnaissance teams being shepherded by members of Congress, because the Capitol is very complicated, all sorts of nooks and crannies. And by the way, a former Black Capitol police officer found it curious that only Democratic Party officers were trashed and none of the others. Others found it curious that even after the siege, about 139, 140 members of Congress decided that the election should be re-examined. In other words, they were going along with the demands of the invaders of the Capitol. And Congressman Clyburn of South Carolina, the leading Black Caucus member, found it curious that the invaders found his hideaway, which has his name is not on the door, and they ignored his office. The new QAnon member from Colorado has been accused of tweeting out where Nancy Pelosi was located at a particular moment. Of course, your homegirl was a target, apparently, of the invaders. And clearly the ruling class is split, but I'm not sure if the dominant wing of the ruling class, and some of my friends on the left say the dominant wing of the ruling class is ready for Trump to go. I don't dispute that, but it's unclear to me whether or not they'll be able to prevail. This is a fast moving story. One of the latest revelations is about transfers of $500,000 in Bitcoin into the virtual wallets of key right-wing figures, apparently from comrades abroad, right-wing comrades abroad. So obviously there needs to be a thorough investigation. I would hope that members of Congress who barely escaped death, because that's the import of the story in the Wall Street Journal this morning, that some of the congresspersons felt that they were either seconds away or a few feet away from expiring or being forced to expire. So I trust that will lead to a thorough investigation. And because, as I said, we're not out of the woods yet by any imagination, by any stretch of the imagination.
What does it look like for our side of the contradiction as far as organizing? What would Black revolutionary movement look like now and adjust our politics to these heightening times?
Well, to return to a theme I introduced a few moments ago, I would hope that we would be trying to rally our allies and comrades abroad. One of the things that the now departed Bay Area-born Black Panther Party tried to do during its brief stay, so to speak, was establish relationships with Cuba. As you probably know, Assata Shakur, who is being chased by the US authorities to this day, has found exile in Cuba. And indeed, when Secretary of State Michael Pompeo put Cuba back on the terror list, part of the bill of indictment was Cuba's failure to return Assata Shakur to these shores. In that regard, something has happened that is worthy of scrutiny, which is that Secretary of State Michael Pompeo had to cancel a trip to Western Europe to meet with so-called allies because they saw them as the representative of a coup plotting government. That speaks to the debate that's taking place at the Human Rights Council of the United Nations as we speak with regard to putting the United States in the dock because of police terror against our community in particular. Now, to a certain extent, our side, Black revolutionaries, have been supporting that United Nations action, but there are others that probably don't even know about it. So I would say that reestablishing our international networks has to be a key priority of any sane Black revolutionary. Secondly, I think we need to put pressure on Black mainstream organizations to engage in an agonizing reappraisal of their history. What I mean is, I've written at length about how during the previous epoch, the Cold War and the Red Scare, the NAACP, which should have been operating like a pre-1994 African National Congress of South Africa, that is to say, a church with many pews, including communists and capitalists alike, instead purged the left, turned its back on Paul Robeson, the great entertainer, revolutionary singer, turned its back on William Patterson, born in San Francisco, approximately 1890, by the way, who was Robeson's closest comrade, and of course filed the original genocide petition with Robeson in 1950 at the United Nations without any support from the NAACP. The NAACP should be compelled at this perilous moment to reassess its history, to apologize for turning its back on radicals of the past, and then take affirmative steps to reformat that conservative policy and to welcome within their ranks the radicals and revolutionaries that they've shunned. I would also say that the radical and revolutionary forces in our community should be trying to ally with our brothers and sisters who are part of the trade union movement, who are part of the working class movement. I took particular interest in the fact that in mid-June 2020, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, headquartered in San Francisco, probably within walking distance of where you all are sitting, shut down ports from Seattle to San Diego in solidarity with Juneteenth, the anniversary of the abolition of slavery, according to some, and also in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. We have probably more brothers and sisters in trade unions than we do in so-called civil rights organizations like the NAACP. Now, of course, there is a coalition of Black trade unionists. It could stand some revolutionary fervor, in my humble opinion. And I would say, finally, that all of us really need to be involved in systematic political education. That can be done through the trade unions, that can be done through the church, that could be done through student associations. And part of the aim should not only be to acquaint ourselves with the volumes of revolutionary literature that provides instruction for us as we move forward, as we march forward, but also I see this as a predicate to return to my original point, which is reestablishing these ties overseas with our comrades and allies, with Cuba in the first place. After all, it's only 90 miles from South Florida, but of course going beyond that as well. And I think that they will be more than eager to accept our outreached hand once we extend it.
What are some glaring weaknesses that you see in the settler colonial project today that can be that resistance can take advantage of?
Well, one of the reasons that I've been emphasizing in my discussions of January 6th, and by the way, you can find them at The Real News, you can find them at analysis.news, you can even find them on Deutsche Welle, German television, my analyses of January 6th, is that January 6th, as I said, represented in some ways a defect of settler colonialism, because the project was based upon apartheid principles, but because of our struggles and the changing global conditions, the settler colonial project has been forced to make halting steps away from those apartheid principles. And as a result, the currency that is whiteness is not as valuable in 2021 as it was in 1960, for example. And to me, that undergirds the revolt. It reveals the fracture between the overwhelmingly Euro-American ruling elite and their foot soldiers. And that's one of the reasons why I've been stressing prosecutions of these miscreants who invaded the Capitol, not only because they violated the law, that's just one aspect, but also because I think it'll introduce tensions within the Republican Party coalition. And right now, since we're on the defensive, we cannot rely solely on our being on the offensive in order to erode or overturn their rule. We also have to play on the contradictions within their coalition, which means pushing measures like prosecutions that will introduce strains within the Republican Party coalition and hopefully will cause them to split. Right now, because our movement is on the defensive, one of our strategic objectives should be helping to foment a split in the ranks of those we are confronting. Because if they are not united, if any group is not united, it's going to be difficult for them to move forward. And so I think certainly we should play upon that. Certainly we should be encouraging a fuller investigation by many different bodies, include not only US bodies, but as some of the most interesting details I've gotten about January 6th have come from this German publication, Business Insider, which, by the way, interviewed the peers in Western Europe of the national security establishment. And they came to the conclusion that January 6th was not a failure of security, it was a failure of a coup. This is a business publication in Western Europe. So we need to be encouraging all manner of investigations because more details will come out that hopefully will allow a crackdown on our opponents, just as they would like to crack down on us, by the way. We'll beat them to the punch. And likewise, Cori Bush, the incoming Congresswoman from St. Louis, has filed a resolution calling for the expulsion of members of Congress who were involved in coup plotting. Names that come to mind include Congressman Paul Gosar of Arizona, Congressman Mo Brooks of Alabama, Congressman Andy Biggs of Arizona. And by the way, for those who write screenplays, I understand I'm talking to artists, when you write your screenplay about January 6th, you must write a role for the man once known as Ali Akbar, now known as Ali Alexander, who according to the Washington Post and his own admissions, he helped to cook up this scheme. He's a Black American, by the way. He helped to cook up this scheme with Biggs, Gosar, and Brooks, by the way. And so we need to talk about expulsions of those members of Congress, and if not prosecutions, they need to be measured for orange jumpsuits. And similarly, the Agent Orange, the oaf in the Oval Office, Mr. 45, he may be able to pardon himself to escape federal charges, although that's a dubious legality. But certainly he won't be able to escape state charges. I know that the authorities in New York, in New York City, and New York State are investigating him. The authorities in Georgia are investigating him because of that curious phone call that he made on January 2nd to the Secretary of State of Georgia, trying to get him to commit a felony to come up with fictitious ballots so that he can win Georgia. And I think that another way to introduce strains in the Republican Party coalition is to go after these leaders, because it's clear that there is now a split with regard to Mr. Trump, although Mr. Trump still has majority support, I would say, within the party. But 10 members of Congress who were Republicans voted for impeachment yesterday. That rift needs to be exploited. And so there are all sorts of contradictions and tensions and fractures in the ranks of the opposition that we need to take advantage of. And I trust and I hope that the Democrats, who, by the way, I could spend the next hour detailing, if not lamenting, their many omissions and failures. But I trust and I hope that since many of them came within a hair's breadth of being executed, that would focus their minds tremendously and compel them to be energetic in going after those who had mayhem in mind. I think that they should take seriously the fact that some of the invaders had plastic handcuffs, that there was a gallows constructed on the grounds of Congress, that the Bible for the ultra-right, Turner Diaries, envisions a scenario where political leadership is executed in mass. I take it that they will take seriously the fact that some of the invaders had homemade napalm. For what reason they plan to use it on January 6th remains unclear. I hope that they reference what happened in Lansing, Michigan, just a few weeks ago, when a number of militiamen were detained after a plot was exposed of supposedly invading the Capitol in Lansing, blowing it up in a made-for-television extravaganza, and then kidnapping members of Congress, members of the state legislature, kidnapping Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, putting her on trial and executing her. I mean, it's still hard to believe that so many were not taking these forces seriously. And I hope that January 6th was a wake-up call, and that now these forces will be taken seriously, because, as I said, we're not out of the woods yet. If people think that, oh, the plot was exposed January 6th, we can go back to sleep. This is just the beginning.
I guess to go back and forth from one side of the principal contradiction to the other, about this political education you were speaking about earlier. You know, today we have internalized, so much ruling class hegemony. A lot of our movement people, or some of the implosions that we see all over the place with movement organizations, even potentials, can very much be traced back to ideological kind of weaknesses and this type of thing. Do you have a prescription for political education that could really shore up our ideological clarity in movement practices?
Well, it's interesting. We have all sorts of resources in this country. I recall, by the way, I used to live in the Bay Area. And I remember working with the Black Panther Party. And of course, they had political education, a part of which involved watching the Battle of Algiers, for example. And even though, I write books, and so I encourage people to read, but I've been made to understand that some people prefer to ingest learning visually. So I think that folks should be made aware that there are so many worthwhile documentaries and narrative films that are highly educational. I mean, just to cite a few off the top of my head, I mentioned the Battle of Algiers, the Ava DuVernay documentary, 13, on the prison industrial complex, for example, and how it's ensnared and entrapped so many Black Americans. Even her piece on the so-called Central Park Five, which is a dramatization of this frame up of these Black youth in New York in the 1980s, When They See Us. I mean, I could go on in this vein. So someone needs to structure a documentary series or a narrative film series going from the 1500s forward up to 2021. Likewise, to return to my jurisdiction, someone needs to formulate a syllabus. Now, I don't want to engage in false modesty, so you could do worse than starting with my book on the 16th century, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, then going to my book on the 17th century, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, then going to my book on 1776, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, then going to my book on the Haitian Revolution, Confronting Black Jacobins, because that was a turning point, certainly in the history of Black people, if not the history of working people and revolutionaries worldwide. Then I would look at my books on 20th century communists and radicals, biographies of Paul Robeson, William Patterson, Shirley Graham Du Bois, etc. Looking comparatively at my book on Southern Africa, which deals with the struggle to overthrow white supremacy there, and also my book on Zimbabwe, which deals with the same subject in the former Rhodesia. And so that's just one person. And, you know, obviously there are other people I could cite or that others could dig up. But I think that that would be a useful beginning.
Mm-hmm. Are there any revolutionary movements or resistance movements that you've seen, now that have impressed you?
Well, certainly the pre-1994, and I keep using that phrase, pre-1994, South African Communist Party and African National Congress. Now, of course, they came to power at a very fraught moment. As I said in my book on Southern Africa, it's no accident, as historians like to say, that Mandela is freed as the Berlin Wall is collapsing, because the apartheid rulers knew that the major backup for the forces in South Africa, that it was collapsing. But pre-1994, for example, look at the work of Govan Mbeki, M-B-E-K-I, the late Govan Mbeki, who was a leader of the South African Communist Party and the African National Congress. Or for that matter, look at the works and biographies of the late Samora Machel, M-A-C-H-E-L, Samora, S-A-M-O-R-A, the founding father of modern Mozambique, for example, who of course was assassinated by the apartheid authorities in the mid-1980s. Or in Angola, where many of our roots rest, more than we realize, a significant percentage of African Americans are actually Angolan Americans. It's no accident, as we like to say, that a major prison in Louisiana is Angola State Prison. I mean, you bring them from Angola and then you put them in a prison called Angola. But look at the writings of the founding father of independent Angola, Agostinho Neto, N-E-T-O, for example. And of course, I would be remiss if I neglected once again the Cuban revolutionary process. You know, I wrote a book on Cuba, which of course I recommend, A Race to Revolution, the United States and Cuba during slavery and Jim Crow. Certainly the many writings and biographies of Fidel Castro, the late Fidel Castro, retained significance. And of course, the Cuban intervention in Southern Africa militarily turned the tide against the apartheid forces and the forces of US imperialism, beginning in the 1970s and continuing for years thereafter. So since I'm speaking to folks in San Francisco, I should also mention Katayama Sen, K-A-T-A-Y-A-M-A, Sen, S-E-N, who was a founder of the Japanese Communist Party. He was of Japanese ancestry, the US Communist Party, and the Mexican Communist Party. A fascinating life, fascinating writer. I'll stop there.
I understand. We'll have to do our digging. You know, as far as like the craft of history, I'm really curious. Just how do you experience history? How do you engage these ideas? How do you keep track? Is there a thread beyond just the collection of fact that you employ?
Mm-hmm. Well, sure. I mean, I have a framework. I mean, I find the processes relied upon by Castro and Kwame Nkrumah and Agostinho Neto and Amilcar Cabral and Govan Mbeki, that is a socialist-oriented framework. I find that very helpful in terms of teasing out class contradictions, teasing out the permutations of white supremacy. But I think that that should be a guide to how we approach history. At least that's my thinking, because I do think you need a framework, and also, I did a webinar with Ishmael Reed, who's one of your neighbors, and it was on his send up of Hamilton, the fabulously profitable musical. And you can find this on YouTube, our session. And one of the things I pointed out, so I'm doing this book on Texas. And so I'm going into the book with this idea that there was solidarity between and amongst the enslaved African population and the indigenous indigenous population fighting the settlers in the 19th century. And that's true. But I also found evidence of Africans, enslaved and otherwise, aligning with the settlers against the indigenous. Now, what the mainstream historians do, they have a theory of the case. And when they encounter evidence that conflicts with their theory, they ignore that evidence because they're pursuing their theory. But my approach is to try to explain what contradicts my theory, because I feel that that'll be helpful to audiences. Because, I'm writing for a global audience. I'm writing for a revolutionary audience. I'm writing for a Black revolutionary audience. And they may encounter contradictions in their own work. And hopefully, if I can explain this contradiction, it'll help them to understand the contradictions they're ensnared by in 2021 going forward. So in sum, I think it's important to start with an outlook, to start with, as I said, a theory of the case. But if you run across evidence that conflicts with your theory, I suggest you try to explain that evidence rather than discard it, because I'm sure you know the saying about the fictional French intellectuals who tell you, well, I know what you're saying is true in fact. The question is it true in theory? In other words, they put their theory of the case above all. And here's another joke. Since I've been talking about Cuba. So one of the Cuban jokes is, this is relevant to January 6th. Why is there so much political instability in Latin America and Africa and not in the United States? The answer is there's no US embassy in Washington, DC. Now, that joke takes on added meaning because once again, I think that January 6th represents chickens coming home to roost. You can't be sending agents and soldiers abroad to overthrow governments to resolve political disputes without them deciding that that's what they should do in their homeland.
What have you seen this commitment to historical materialism in other other historians, writers, just people, other people's craft who you might dig?
Oh, sure. You want me to cite some?
Yeah, please.
Well, first of all, you know the old saying that some people speak prose even though they don't know what the word prose means. And some historians engage in historical materialism even though that term means little or nothing to them. And the list I'm about to cite, that last statement doesn't necessarily apply to, but it will apply to some of the people that I mentioned. So certainly with regard to my peers, I admire the work of your fellow Californian, Robin Kelley of UCLA. I admire the work of David Roediger, Roediger, who writes on whiteness, basically writing about white supremacy, but writing on the construction of whiteness. Likewise, with regard to the construction of whiteness, I found very illuminating the book by Nell Irvin Painter, The History of White People. Very interesting. I found useful the book by Roger Keeran, Keeran, the Communist Party and the Auto Workers Union. Let's see, who else?
Do you have any do you have any kind of advice for those who want to integrate more, you know, or who better integrate more kind of dialectical materialism into their work? How they can you know, how they can begin to do that, or what might they need to do?
Well, hopefully we're at the end of this. 1991 marks the 30th anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which of course was celebrated in Washington, and of course helped to inaugurate a period of neoliberalism and savage attacks on the living standards of the working class and fierce persecution of Black people in terms of the construction of the prison industrial complex. But before, even during that period, but certainly before 1991, and even after, I would always recommend to students these 3 volumes by Maurice Cornforth, late of the British Communist Party. Cornforth, Cornforth, just like it sounds. They're thin little books, but very revelatory. Historical materialism, dialectical materialism, and the theory of knowledge. And I used to recommend those. I even used to have copies I would give away to people. Maybe I probably should start doing that again. But that's what I would recommend. Because as I said, I mean, charitably speaking, we've been in a state of suspended animation for decades now. More realistically speaking, there's been enormous regression. So a deep hole has been dug for us. And hopefully, as I said, January 6th is a hinge moment. I would like to think that people are waking up, that the sight of a failed coup is enough to wake up even those who are deep in slumber. I would like to think that. And certainly, I would hope that those who are eavesdropping on our conversation will take that to heart.
I should actually, if we have apologies to people in the audience who had questions earlier, I should have asked for them. So if you have questions, please type them in the chat, and I will read them. While we're waiting, I guess while we're waiting for people to get enough courage together, what you know, history has been so alienated from a lot of modern psyche. There's a lot of kind of just ahistorical mentality running rampant. How did we get to that point, and how can that be remedied?
Well, I mean, I think it's obvious how we got to that point. That is to say that the US ruling elite, I mean, it's like an 18th century army, which retreats when forced to, but then digs in. And then you have to push them after that position, and then they retreat, and then they dig in. We have not been able to get them to the point where they surrender. And I think that one of the tools that they have used has been obviously through their wealth. It's amazing the number of people you can buy off for $75,000 a year. And
or cheap.
What do you think?
I said, or cheaper than that.
Or cheaper than that. Yeah, I was trying to make people look better. I mean, saying that they sell off for $25,000 a year doesn't sound too good. But, and so it's obvious. I mean, they use this reward system, you know, they reward those who go along, they punish those who don't. And that is just the nature of the beast. And part of the reward system is steering clear of any sort of radical or revolutionary thinking, not to mention radical or revolutionary action, and punishing those severely who are so bold as to ignore their precept about steering clear of revolutionary radical action. So I think it's rather obvious what's transpired in recent decades.
Mr. Wilson, you have to type your question into the chat box. Until you do, how might U.S. hegemony end?
That's a difficult question to answer, because now I have to engage in speculation. Hopefully, it'll be informed speculation. But I think that's what's happened. Obviously, the United States miscalculated severely. As a matter of fact, in my book on the 16th century, I talk about how during that period 500 years ago, at least with regard to Europe and the Atlantic Basin, the major powers were Muslim Turkey and Catholic Spain. Of course, Spain had been ruled by the Muslims up until 1492. But what happens is that the Ottoman Turks, in some ways, they underestimate Protestant England, which is a minor monarchy on the fringes of Europe, in pursuit of trying to destabilize their main antagonist, Catholic Spain. And so I draw an analogy between what happened during the Cold War, where the United States was obsessed with Moscow. So approximately 50 years ago, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger is dispatched to China. An entente is brokered with the People's Republic of China against Moscow. In return, China gets massive foreign direct investment, which has now created this juggernaut that's in the passing lane. And of course, China, and I'm not anti-China, by the way, far from it. Matter of fact, I've been accused of being in the tank for China, but that's not true. But in any case, China, of course, pays US imperialism back. It attacks Vietnam after the United States is ousted from Vietnam in 1975. And now the United States is trying to, as I said, launch this new Cold War against China. I don't think it's going to work out, but I've been wrong before. But if it doesn't work out, you'll see, it seems to me, if the labor movement is not energized and the Black revolutionary movement is not energized, you're going to see an increasing collapse in the living standards of people of the United States. It's unclear if that contradiction can be resolved through war, because that didn't work out very well in Afghanistan, in Iraq, nor Libya. But I think this is one of the signals from January 6th. It could be resolved by, as opposed to shedding blood abroad, shedding blood at home. Particularly since the forces at home are less organized than the forces overseas. And so we're sort of a sitting duck right now, an easy target, if you like. But if that process unfolds, I don't see it ending very well, even for the US ruling class. I see continued devolution. And just like Ottoman Turkey was once one of the major powers, now it's, I guess, in the top 15. You could see something happening with regard to US imperialism, a steady decline. And particularly since this happened on January 6th too, there's a tendency in the US ruling elite to overreach You saw that in 1861, when Lincoln was willing to cut a deal with the slave owners, but no, they wouldn't accept the deal. They decided to overthrow Lincoln so that they could keep expanding slavery. And then they lost everything. At least they lost their enslaved African property. Let's put it that way. And I see January 6th as an overreach as well, or at least I hope it turns out to be an overreach. It's too soon to say, but it looks like it was a classic overreach that will lead, if we organize properly, into imprisoning many of our opponents, weakening our opponents, and then moving forward.
Again, I want to extend the invitation to write questions in the chat box. What are prospects of global revolution, of a defeat of ruling classes worldwide?
Well, the easy answer is, in the long term, we're optimistic. There's some heartening signals, despite the look at our hemisphere. In Bolivia, as you know, we had a comeback after the coup against Evo Morales. I expect a comeback in Brazil by the Workers' Party because of how Bolsonaro has done worse in handling the pandemic even than his comrade, Agent Orange. In Argentina, a hopeful sign was the fact that patriarchy took a beating with the restoration of women's reproductive freedom. The Communist Party of Vietnam is holding its Congress, as is the Workers' Party of North Korea. And as of now, it does not seem to be any external challenge to their rule. In India, you see that the BJP and the Hindu nationalists are under siege by the farmers. That bodes well for the future. Of course, Prime Minister Modi is a close comrade of Mr. Trump. As noted, with regard to the European Union, I know that many on the left in Britain were in favor of Brexit, and many were opposed. But in any case, objectively, Brexit is going to cause many problems for London. And as noted, it's going to strengthen what President Macron calls the strategic autonomy of the EU, so it could better confront US imperialism. And note there, the conflicts between Airbus and Boeing, between SAP of Germany and Oracle, Silicon Valley. Note as well the attempts by France to slap higher taxes on Amazon, for example. So I'm reasonably optimistic about the future because I'm optimistic about the increasing crisis of US imperialism, which it seems to me will mean a crisis for world imperialism and ultimately would be a boost for revolutionary forces.
So I figured out where the questions were going. Apologies, for my lack of savvy. We have a question here. What are your thoughts on the oppression of women, and what are your thoughts on the concept of intersectionality?
Well, intersectionality is not necessarily a new idea. If you look at the writings of Trinidad-born Claudia Jones, who of course was a leader of the Communist Party of the United States before being deported back to London, where she becomes a leader of the Black community in London about the late 1950s. I mean, she was talking about what amounts to intersectionality and triple jeopardy as early as the 1940s. So certainly that's a concept that is worthy of further interrogation and further support. With regard to the first half of the question, I would point the questioner to my biography of Shirley Graham Du Bois, who was one of the leading radical revolutionary figures of the 20th century. In my biography, I give her credit for helping to move her better known spouse, W.E.B. Du Bois, to the left. And of course, I've written on W.E.B. Du Bois too, just as a footnote. And I would say that part of what's happening today with regard to the pandemic, as is well known, is that it's not just been a recession or a depression, it's been a she-cession. That is to say, it's had a particularly devastating impact on working class women who find that they're now engaged in double duty. That is to say, assuming that they have a job, trying to do their job, and then finding at home the burden increases in terms of trying to shepherd their children, assuming they have children, in terms of their own instruction, for example. I think as well that on the other side of the ledger, that one of the disturbing aspects of the current conjuncture in the United States is the role that a number of Euro-American women have played in terms of building up the reactionary forces. And by the way, I talk about this in my 16th century book, because in my 16th century book, if you'll notice, even though there's this idea that the English get involved with enslavement of Africans in 1619, I push it back to the 1490s, with the early enslaved in London basically being the equivalent of labor-saving devices. That is to say, imported as unpaid servants into the homes of affluent European women, which helps to plant the seeds of anti-Blackness, racism, reduction of consciousness about gender oppression, etc. And in fact, there is a scholar right across the bay at UC Berkeley. What's her name? Stephanie Rogers, I think. She just written a book on Euro-American women and slavery, pointing to their pivotal role in terms of...
they were her property too, or something?
Yeah, that's it. Something like that, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that helps to provide historical perspective for this so-called Karen phenomenon that you read about so much in the press. So, I mean, I could go on in this vein, but I'll stop and take the next question.
Another question, what are your thoughts on Afro-pessimism?
Well, I'm an Afro-optimist, basically. I'm familiar with that literature. I don't subscribe to it. Part of that literature has the defect of a lot of literature in the United States, is that it's not internationally grounded. But sure, if I were just looking at the United States with the strength of US imperialism, the strength of white supremacy, the weakness of the trade union movement, the weakness of the radical revolutionary movement, I'd be a pessimist too. Matter of fact, I'd probably call myself a mega Afro-pessimist. Introduce a new word. But I don't just look at the United States. I'm trying to look at the world. And see, they don't look at the world. And some of them, when they do look at the world, it seems to me they're fabricating and fictionalizing, but that's another story for another day.
Another question. I'm gonna kind of summarize, but basically, having so many of us having really internalized white supremacy, fascism, and pretty much practice it. day in, day out. How do we address that? How do we address that destruction of our psyche, and the prospect of white supremacy without white people?
Well, I would only refer to some of my previous responses. I mean, I think it has to be done organizationally. I mean, on the positive side, if you look at the past 60 years, we've had tremendous victories over white supremacy. And certainly, I think that those victories came by dint of organization. They came by dint of militancy. They came by dint of education and reading and study groups, for example. And I think that that particular recipe is the recipe we need to utilize going forward. Because, you know, starting, I guess, in the late 1980s, I started writing these pieces about what I call the crisis of white supremacy. And that crisis, to me, has accelerated in recent decades. And one of the questions, I wish some of these Afro-pessimists, for example, and many Black scholars and revolutionaries in general, would answer this simple question. What are the prospects for white supremacy in the 21st century, given the rise of China? Now, usually when I ask that question, people start acting like, well, China will be white supremacists too, which shows like a lack of imagination. It's almost like you're so into this thing that you're going to turn everybody into white supremacists because you don't want to study, you don't want to read, you want to assume that what you know now, it will be good for all time, which is not true. You have to keep studying. As I said, when you come across contrary evidence that conflicts with your theory of the case, you shouldn't just shunt the evidence aside. You should try to understand that evidence. And so that the person who asked the question about Afro-pessimism, they should ask one of these Afro-pessimists that question. Not only ask them, but ask them to write about it. Go on the record, because anybody can talk. Go on the record. Put something down in black and white.
Right on. Someone tuning in would like your take on, the burning of the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis and the uprisings of the summer.
Well, I would like to think it's a turning point. I mean, certainly the global response was heartening. The simultaneous demonstrations in Western Europe and Australia, et cetera. The black eye, pardon the expression, administered to US imperialism as a result of George Floyd's killing and the subsequent protests. The fact that that gave energy to what I've already made reference to, the debate at the Human Rights Council of the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. The fact that in Portland, for example, where you've had this amazing train of protests since May 25th, raising up slogans like stolen people on stolen land. Because it's interesting, to the discredit of a goodly number of revolutionaries and radicals, many of them really haven't tackled the question of settler colonialism. They haven't tackled the question of indigenous dispossession. I mean, believe it or not, trust me, many of them have not. All you have to do is look at what they've written. And I think that I've seen since May 25th, particularly coming out of Portland, but not only Portland, an increasing attention to the fundamentals in this country being settler colonialism and native dispossession in the first instance. Oh, is there another question?
Yeah, yes, there is. I mean, there's several. I'm gonna get word of advice. The best questions are the short ones. So I have to do these little, calculations. But what could you speak on? What's your opinion of contemporary labor movement, class collaboratory practices, and the implications of gig economy, and and how nonprofits figure into this picture?
Well, interestingly enough, with regard to the so-called gig economy, I wrote a book some years ago called Class Struggle in Hollywood. And it's about the labor movement in the film industry and how it was broken on the wheel of repression, red baiting, anti-communism, etc. And that helped to contribute to what I call the Hollywood mode of production, whereby unlike in some studios where you had carpenters, electricians, even actors as wage workers, you convert them all to so-called contractors, and hardly with any benefits, and they're supposed to be small business persons. And in a sense, that anticipates Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and anticipates the referendum on the ballot in California in November 2020 to understand that Uber, Lyft et al. Won. And with regard to class collaboration, the particular problem in the United States is that the country, as noted in my previous remarks, was built on class collaboration. I mean, settler colonialism is class collaboration. And as I've written previously, class collaboration is one of the highest forms of white supremacy, and white supremacy is one of the highest forms of class collaboration. What I mean is that class collaboration and settler colonialism involves Europeans of different class backgrounds collaborating for their mutual benefit to dispossess the Native Americans. I mean, it's just like, I was reviewing a manuscript by comrades the other day where they were speaking positively of the Homestead Act. And you'll find this amongst many revolutionaries, I'm afraid to say. The Homestead Act, 1860s, whereby the government and the Lincoln government basically dispossesses the Native American and then parcels out the land to poor Europeans. And we're supposed to endorse that, you see, when actually it's really just another form of class collaboration. And so part of the problem in the United States is that class collaboration is sort of normalized. It's even seen by revolutionaries as a positive good, at least historically. They wouldn't say that about 2021, I don't think. And so that makes it very difficult because, once again, to circle back to January 6th, it was a classic example of class collaboration. You had people flying in on private planes, you had CEOs, and you also had working class police officers, transit workers, firefighters, you had lumpen elements, you had unemployed, almost all of European descent, although screenplay writers pay close attention to Ali Akbar, Ali Alexander. Needs to be investigated. What's his name?
I said, we won't let him get away.
No. But it's a classic example of class collaboration. That's why I would like to think that January 6th represents a kind of dying gasp of class collaboration. I would like to think that, but time will tell.
I don't know how much more time we have, and I don't want to hold you. I want to hold you forever. I think that there was one interesting question that might be groovy to conclude with. Just someone wanted to know what did you want people what do you want people to walk away from this conversation with? Is there anything you'd like to emphasize again?
Well, sure. I would emphasize again, organizationally, we need to strengthen our ties internationally with our neighbors across the Florida Straits in Cuba in the first instance. We need to give aid and support to our allies in Geneva who are now pursuing US imperialism with regard to police terror, leading to a best case scenario of sanctions imposed on US imperialism because of its atrocious treatment of Black people, shooting us down like dogs in the streets. I would like to see more study. I get paid so far to be a teacher and a writer, so I would be remiss if I did not underscore that. I gave out a sort of mini bibliography during the course of our discussion, and for those who are not inclined to reading, they find it very 20th century. There's a whole passel of films and documentaries that you could spend the rest of your life, if you were so inclined, screening very worthwhile documentaries and narrative films. Our filmmakers and our artists really need a pat on the back for, especially the documentary filmmakers, because there's so many obstacles. You got to get funded, then there's distribution, but yet they keep churning out this great work. It's, just today I read a review of a documentary I plan to watch. I haven't seen it yet, entitled MLK/FBI, obviously about Martin Luther King and the FBI, by Sam Paul. It sounds very worthwhile. Look at there's just so many documentaries. Anyway, so I would also say that with regard to you folks in the Bay Area, that you have a special obligation since Nancy Pelosi is one of your neighbors. So I would hope that you would keep her feet to the fire and make sure that there is a thorough investigation of this attempted coup of January 6th. I would hope that she would want that, since supposedly they were searching for her. So I would hope that provides her incentive, but you never know with these folks, So keep her feet to the fire with regard to January 6th. And of course, we need to organize more unions, more tenants unions, more student unions, more unions. In terms of churchgoers need to have study circles within the church. For example, my book on the 16th century, a lot of that's religious history that the church religious community should really pay careful and close attention to what's in that 16th century book. Matter of fact, all believers should pay close attention to what I say in the 16th century book, but particularly Christians, meaning Protestants and Catholics, particularly Muslims, particularly the Jewish community. They need to pay close attention to that book, because I'm afraid to say that part of the crisis of the 21st century has its roots in the 16th century, when religious conflict was all the rage. And to make a long story short, part of how these religious contradictions were resolved was through the construction of race, with people of different religious backgrounds uniting in this new identity politics called whiteness for their mutual advantage vis-a-vis the indigenous population of the Americas and the enslaved Africans. And in a nutshell, that's how we got to this point of crisis.
Man, we greatly appreciate you putting up with me. And right on. And thank you everybody who tuned in. Also, apologies to everybody whose question we didn't get to. There were some beautiful questions in there. We'll just have to figure them out together, So I don't know if you know. We also want to thank the lab. I don't know if Dina want to come back on here and.
Dina, it's your cue.
Thanks everyone for joining, and especially Gerald and Tongo. That was such a beautiful talk, and I think one of the best I've heard about the situation we find ourselves in today. So much appreciation to the both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I can sign off now, right?
Yep. Have a great night. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Good luck. Bye.